And thank you for having me here. And a special thank you to Ambassador Sands for the introduction to this very distinguished forum. It's a pleasure to be with all of you here today. I am going to be very concise in my presentation. I know we want to try to leave some time for a Q&A. So if I can ask that guy in the back, the specialist here, can we dim the lights in here so that everyone can see the slideshow and we can make it pop? Ladies and gentlemen, I've been asked to discuss some of the major global challenges that we face here in the United States and with our allies and partners worldwide. And let's see if we can get this to go to the next slide. Can we go to the next slide, please? Okay. And I'm going to focus on three regional issues. And you don't need to take photos of this, ladies and gentlemen. We can provide a PDF of the slide deck afterwards. Just talk to the Congressman or to Lucas and we'll get that to everyone. But what we see here, can we dim the lights in this room? Because nobody can see anything. So what I have here, ladies and gentlemen, I'll describe it to you, is a map of the world. It's a satellite photo that demonstrates that 70% of the Earth's surface is comprised of oceans, waterways, and seas. And it is on these waterways that 80% of the world's oil and natural gas moves around the world, and 90% of global commerce takes place every year. And the reason that we enjoy the incredible quality of life that we do in the West and in countries that are aspired to achieve that Western standard of living is this free and open international trading system led and protected by the United States and our allies worldwide. And besides the United States, which obviously by leading and protecting this free and open trading system, benefiting from it, probably the other country that has benefited the most from this is China, led by the Communist Party of China, which Matt Pottinger and Jonathan Ward have done a good job today of illuminating further on regarding their nefarious activities in Asia against their own people and now on an international scale, especially against the United States. Because this is the great strategic threat that we face here in Washington on behalf of the American people and increasingly in our communications with our allies and partners around the world. And everything that we do, ladies and gentlemen, involving China in any transactional manner must pass through the filter of the Communist Party of China. This is not a normal country. It is a country that has been taken over by a Leninist party that has absolute control over every aspect of China's economy, its military, its society, all of its systems. That is the number one priority of the Chinese Communist Party every day of the year. It is not a normal country and it is not a normal market. And if you look at, I think yesterday or today's New York Times, now even the financial sector of China must undergo rigid Marxist, Leninist ideological training. This is all happening under Xi Jinping, who is the General Secretary of the Communist Party and the Chairman of the Chinese Military Commission, the Central Military Commission. We like to call him President. That's very diplomatic. But President sounds like he won a fair election. It confers electoral legitimacy. The only reason he's as powerful as he is because he controls the Chinese Communist Party. So please keep that in mind anytime you're engaged in your diplomatic transactions with your Chinese counterparts. And we'll talk a little bit here, and I don't want to be too redundant because some of the prior speakers have covered China's very belligerent, aggressive activities quite effectively. But keep in mind, ladies and gentlemen, that under Xi Jinping, China has adopted an almost ferocious foreign policy, certainly against Taiwan, but also against Japan, whose territory it outright threatens and claims, against South Korea, against the Philippines. Those three countries, Japan, South Korea, and Philippines, are all American allies. We are legally obligated to their defense in the event of any tensions or conflict with China. And then there are all of the other countries in the South China Sea whose territorial waters China claims as their own, claiming 1,000 miles off of China's southern coast as essentially a Chinese lake in contravention of international law, international agreements, and for those of you who are signatories, the Convention on the Law of the Sea. And I think Jonathan Ward made the point earlier, oh, that's you, okay, about how there are these DF-26 carrier-killing missiles that China is now able to deploy to keep the United States military at bay 1,000, 1,500, maybe in the future 2,000 miles away from the Asian coastline, which means we might no longer be able to provide a credible deterrent against China for any of its activities against Japan, against South Korea, against Philippines. And once that security umbrella is shredded, it's a completely different international order in Asia, and one that we have to work much more assiduously here in the United States with our Asian allies to prevent from ever taking place. Now, Ukraine, ladies and gentlemen, this is a very unfortunate situation. We all know the tremendous pain that the Ukrainian people are suffering and that the Ukrainian economy has suffered. Essentially a 30% cratering of the Ukrainian economy over the last 2 years. And we see that Russia is now sitting on 4 oblasts in eastern Ukraine and the Crimea, and you're following the debate here in Washington, D.C. about whether or not American support for Ukraine can be sustained. It may get through this next hurdle, but I'm very much concerned this is not sustainable beyond 2024. You've heard from a number of lawmakers earlier about the severe problems that we face in the United States with our own domestic security, with our southern border. And if that issue is not resolved first, I assure you, tens of millions of Americans will say, put Ukraine on the shelf and take care of America domestically first. We have to get our domestic house in order to be able to effectively provide for the security of our partners and friends like Ukraine. It's not an ally. It's a very important distinction. We come to the defense of our allies automatically. We don't have to come to the defense of partners and friends. We choose to. But that may mean that that support can run out. And so I'm very much afraid that we're facing a very, very dire situation in Ukraine, and I don't know how the country can be effectively reconstructed short of a $500 billion to $1 trillion investment that may take 20 to 30 years, and that really will fall more on Europe's shoulders than America's, because we have the strategic threat of China to contend with. Ukraine is not a direct security threat to the United States. China's ambitions in Asia and around the world are. So you need to understand that we in America are dealing with limited strength, limited military capability, and we also don't have the support of most of the world in Ukraine. This is a very stark reminder, ladies and gentlemen, that when we talk about the sanctions regime, they're not international, they're Western. They're the United States, they're the European Union, Japan, South Korea, Australia, and New Zealand. The global South has checked out of the Ukraine war. They want no part of it because they're very heavily dependent on Russia for commodities, oil, gas, coal, timber, natural resources, foodstuffs, fertilizers, weaponry to defend their countries against their aggressive neighbors, armaments for their own law enforcement, whether to protect dictatorships or to maintain the peace. That's what Russia means to most of the world. So we talk about one thing in Europe and the United States, but if we want to be respectful of our neighbors around the world, we need to understand why they don't see this as anything more than an intra-European conflict that does not affect their national security one whit. So while we are imposing these sanctions on Russia, Russia is finding ways to circumvent the sanctions and to find other places to sell their oil and natural gas. And their number one consumer, along with India, of course, is China, which now is exploiting the Western support for Ukraine and the Western sanctions regime to buy as much oil and gas to provide for energy security for the Chinese economy, especially if there's a conflict with the United States and we cut off their maritime supply of oil and gas from the Middle East. They want to have as vast a reserve as possible of oil and natural gas from external markets, and that's why they are consuming and producing half of the world's coal every year. So while people are talking about climate in Dubai, the Chinese are polluting like no one else in the world, and no one is doing a single thing about it. Everyone is focused on what America and Europe are doing, but no one seems to really be putting any pressure on the Chinese. And not only this, but we have Russia and China that are co-developing a natural gas facility in the Yamal Peninsula along Russia's Arctic frontier. And now Russia is determined to exploit vast oil and natural gas reserves beneath the Arctic Ocean, which I will posit is going to be one of the next critical theaters of strategic competition between Russia and China on one side, the US, potentially Canada, and Northern European countries on the other side. But while we're focused on ensuring that all of our oil and gas reserves stay underground, not to be used to provide for prosperous societies and for economic development, the Russians and the Chinese together will extract as much oil and gas as possible to provide for their own societies and to export and generate revenue for their respective economies. If anyone should have learned this lesson for us, ladies and gentlemen, it's Germany and other European countries that willingly decided to become completely dependent on Russia, a hostile authoritarian regime, for their energy and therefore for their economic well-being. And Germany's ideological commitment to decarbonization and these net zero targets that the laws of physics and the laws of economics don't care one bit about is now going into a period of deindustrialization. And the question is going to be, which other Western countries will adopt these foolish, nonsensical net zero targets at the expense of the well-being of their societies, especially when our adversaries are exploiting all of these abundant natural resources. The Middle East. This is not Israel and Hamas, ladies and gentlemen. It's an Iranian invasion of Israel via Hamas, the proxy of Iran. Hamas doesn't press a traffic light button without the okay from Tehran. We need to remember this. Everything that has happened against Israel is at the behest of the mullahs in Tehran, and the Iranian Revolutionary Guard Corps is the instrument of Iran, which the State Department, through Democratic and Republican administrations, has deemed the world's leading state sponsor of international terrorism for almost 40 years now. The greatest threat to stability in the Middle East and beyond, has these proxies in Iraq, in Syria, in Lebanon, in Gaza, in Yemen, and also in Afghanistan, looking to destroy Israel, if they have the means, to destabilize Sunni Arab countries, and of course to threaten American and Western interests and assets throughout the region. Now, the United States isn't as impacted directly as we were back in the 1970s because we're now an energy superpower and we export our vast, abundant oil and natural gas. So we're resilient against any possible shocks to oil and gas supplies. But Asian countries get 80%, 80, of their oil and natural gas from the Middle East. So they need that Strait of Hormuz to be open. China, Japan, Taiwan, South Korea, the Southeast Asian tigers. Europe needs the Bab al-Mandab down by Yemen and Djibouti to be open, and the Suez Canal in Egypt to be open. So when we're there protecting these choke points, we're not doing it for the United States. We're doing it for our Asian and European allies, backed by US taxpayer dollars to provide for our Navy to work with the navies and militaries of our allies and partners in the region. But there are going to be limitations, ladies and gentlemen, because we're facing a very dire situation here in Washington, D.C. One of the lawmakers mentioned $33 trillion debt, an absolutely astonishing and irresponsible figure as an American citizen. But we are also about to enter a very unprecedented period of sustained federal debt payments that will surpass the military budget of the United States. So we're not going to touch health care, we're not going to touch our pension funds, and we have to pay our debt obligations to bondholders in America and around the world. So the defense budget of the United States is going to get squeezed in the years ahead, just as the global crises intensify in Asia, in Europe, and in the Middle East. So let's finish off here, ladies and gentlemen, on global energy markets, because these are critical to the ability of the United States, your countries, those that are rich and those that are poor that want to become rich, to empower their people, to enrich your societies, to become affluent and influential members of the international community. This is the Biden administration's own projection of US energy consumption. And you see here that President Biden, with all of their commitments to net zero targets and the like, admit that in 2050, the United States is still going to be using oil and natural gas for 70%, 70, of American domestic oil and gas or overall energy consumption. Globally, I will tell you, when you hear the phrase energy transition, ladies and gentlemen, it's a lie. There is no energy transition. There are energy additions. There are energy supplements. This is the historical record. It's very clear. Every time a new energy form that is scalable, affordable, reliable, and accessible comes to market, you layer it on top of the energy sectors that are already in place. Oil, coal, and natural gas are going nowhere, ladies and gentlemen, over the next 30 years for the foreseeable future. And this is the International Energy Agency. They just released this in October, and they're concurring. 2 charts ago, I showed you the US. That's my timer. I'm almost done, Congressman. This is global energy consumption predictions forecast by the International Energy Agency. And you see those nice little colors on top, green and yellow. That's solar and wind. There will be an increasingly important part, but by 2050, there's still a minuscule part of overall global energy production. So this chart, ladies and gentlemen, will show you 4 decades and $4 trillion of investments almost completely by affluent Western countries, Europe, America, and some of our Asian partners. $4 trillion later, the yellow bar is solar and wind 4 decades ago, about 4 to 5% of global energy production. Today, it's about 12 to 15% after $4 trillion. The overwhelming preponderance of of energy production on the world stage today is oil, gas, coal, and nuclear power. And I don't see any rocket-like trajectory changing anytime soon. So next time someone asks you about net zero, ask them to show you the data. The data will utterly belie net zero ambitions. Physics and economics laws don't care about human target years that end in 5 and 0. One other thing. Germany is teaching us the lesson of being dependent on a hostile authoritarian regime for your energy and therefore for your economy. So why would we in the West become dependent on China's control over rare earths processing and refinement for all of the technological instruments that make life as convenient, as beautiful as it is in the West? They control almost all of the rare earths processing on a global scale. So if they decide not to invade Taiwan, but to take a tiny little Taiwanese island 1 mile off the coast of China, and we decide to respond in kind with some type of a diplomatic response, are we willing to see the Western lights turned off because there's a hiccup in the supply chain of Chinese processed and refined rare earths to the West? Is this really what we think is best for the advanced industrial civilized world that we enjoy and that is so prosperous today and hopefully will be for the years to come? So I will close by positing that I am very thankful that America remains a great, great natural gas superpower. It is the #1 producer of natural gas on the world stage today. That the United States, along with Russia and Saudi Arabia, is an oil superpower, and this gives us the strength and the leverage to be able to exert diplomatic power worldwide. And I will close on this. Václav Smil, brilliant scientist, read his books when you get a chance, makes very clear that the world that we live in the West, the advanced industrial civilization that we enjoy today that gives us tremendous benefits that we must never take for granted, are utterly dependent on the energy-dense, energy-intensive industries of cement production, glass production, ammonia production, steel production, and plastics production, all of which require oil, natural gas. Without those, the West starts to disappear. Tell me which politician is willing to face this stark truth. So, ladies and gentlemen, energy abundance, energy dominance, energy sovereignty, not energy poverty. And the West can prevail over China, over Russia, and Iran, but not if we're digging our own hole. Thank you very much.